Hi, I'm Katie Litz, and I'm here to talk to you today about good by design, or rather, why consumer centricity really matters for your digital business. So I work at Which. My role is head of digital and scams policy at Which, and I'm sure most of you, hopefully all of you, have heard about what we do at Which. You'll probably know us for advising consumers on products, and we've been doing that since 1957. We've advised consumers on innovations, every innovation going, anything from the toaster to TVs, washing machines, cars, mobile phones, laptops, tablets, etc. And of course, now as everything pretty much is digital or has some digital component, our work in digital is growing rapidly and entering lots of new areas actually around data and consumer privacy. What else do we do? So in addition to advising consumers, we also influence and advise governments and policymakers and regulators on a whole bunch of issues affecting consumers in the digital space. And this list is just an example of some of the kind of work that we do. So if the government puts out a white paper, we respond to it, always championing the voice of the consumer. In addition to that, of course, I'm hoping anyway to talk to businesses, which is why I'm here sharing some of the work that we do with you as digital businesses. And we do that because we want to engage directly with businesses as you're on your journey of developing great products and services for consumers. And hopefully we're able to advise on how to shape some of those products and services so that they really work for consumers. Our mission at Which is, of course, to make consumers as powerful as the organisations that they deal with on a daily basis. And it's fair to say that there's asymmetry at the moment, mainly because organisations are processing huge amounts of data about consumers. And unfortunately, consumers are starting to feel rather out of control. So why should digital businesses go beyond compliance with regulation and adopt principles around good by design? What does that mean? Why should you go over and above the things that you have to do by law? So of course, we all know GDPR. It's been around for 2 years already, and I hope that we're all familiar with it and using it in our products and services, and certainly complying with the regulation that you need to. And of course, the 7 principles really cover consumer data and privacy thereof. And it's around lawfulness, being transparent with consumers, limiting what you do with their data, being accurate, making sure that you keep the right data and use it for the right purposes, and increasing your kind of integrity and confidentiality. But really that's about security, so you make sure you store it safely. And then being accountable, so in the event of something goes wrong, you let your users know. So we all know those principles, and we're all hopefully abiding by them, or at least doing our best to. So why go over and above that? I think compliance isn't quite enough. And I think that that's because consumers are starting to feel quite worried about the amount of data that's out there about them. In fact, our research shows that there's a widespread sense of disempowerment amongst consumers and an increasing mistrust of digital advertising. And this affects everybody. So it's not just the fact that this affects a digital advertising business. The fact that consumers across the board are generally more concerned means that they're potentially turning off, they're potentially going to extreme lengths to avoid sharing their data with you guys. And also it's creating increased risk, so that you might not be conforming with all the regulations that you need to in order to protect them if we're not sure what to do. So we have some research that we work on at Which, and I'm sharing with you some stats actually from a report we published back in 2018. So it's slightly old, but we have some new updates to it, which I'll share with you today. And that was called Control Alt Delete. And really it was about exposing how consumers feel about data and trust. And interestingly, we actually found that at the time, 35% of people were tolerant of sharing their data with digital businesses. We have some other segments that we studied, and those are tolerant, concerned, anxious, and liberal. And we have that shared on a website. So if anyone's interested in those and digging a little bit deeper into those and consumer attitudes towards data sharing, we've got all of that available. But what I find more interesting about this stuff is that between 2018, when we first took that test, or understood the sentiment amongst consumers, and 2019, just a year later, things really, really changed. And so those 35% of people who were tolerant actually turned into 21% of people a year later. And the people that were liberal, who were really happy for their data to be shared, went from 13% to 8%. At the same time, anyone who was concerned increased 29% to 38%. And the people who were anxious increased as well from 23 to 33%. So you can see that in a short space of time, in just 12 months, the feelings of consumers about how much they trust digital businesses with their data has kind of gone down. And I would bet money on the fact that when we do these tests again, these surveys again in 2020, we find that the trend line has continued and that trust is further eroded, which is unfortunate. So why is this happening? When we look at, how digital businesses actually profile consumers, or at least how, maybe not how your digital business might profile consumers, but if you're sharing data with data brokers, if we look at the amount of data that's out there about an individual, it encompasses all sorts of different types of things. And that's where people start to get a bit concerned, because you might share your certain amount of data with one business, but you're not aware when you're doing that you've already perhaps shared a whole bunch of other stuff with a massive array of other businesses or data brokers. So when we show people things like this, they tell us that they just feel out of control. How on earth has this stuff been collected about them? They don't really feel like they've consented to this, even though probably they have. But the feeling of being out of control is quite scary for people. Also the relevance. So people are confused as to why this is needed, why organizations need to know this about them, why this is shared. And they struggle to understand the benefits to them of having shared this. Or why have I done this? What am I getting out of it? Am I getting rewarded for it? Possibly not. And then people start to consider that they might actually be suffering harm from having shared this. What if, for example, they've shared sensitive data, maybe about their financial situation, maybe about their age or sexuality or religious beliefs, and they start worrying about, well, will that impact them? Will that mean that they're discriminated against in some way? So it puts people on edge. And in fact, we found that a whopping 89% of the population really dislike the idea of third-party data sharing. So of course, this is first party, I'm sharing my data with a platform, that's the second party, but the third party is when that's then shared with somebody else. And that's the bit consumers are worried about. So if they're sharing it with you and that's all part of your privacy policy, but you're also sharing it with somebody else, the challenge there really is to explain to consumers as to why that's happening and how they're going to benefit from it. Many people feel, after sort of learning about this, that they don't really have much of a choice. So they know that they're using services that are free at the point of use, as long as they're sharing their data, because that's the business model of the services that they're using. And a lot of people are resigned to that fact and kind of not necessarily comfortable with it, but fine with it, let's say. But there's an increasing number of people who are going to rather extreme lengths to do something about it, to avoid actually sharing their data. So our research found that 27% of consumers actually already use a different email account from their normal one to use with organisations or businesses that they don't want to receive communication from. 14% deliberately give incorrect information on a form, kind of dirtying their data. And 20% of the UK population, at least more than 20%, have installed ad blockers to try and stop data collection. I find that really interesting, and I think that that trend is going to continue, and we're going to see more and more and more of that. I see it with people using VPNs as well. So what can digital businesses do? Is there an opportunity here to increase trust in your service by your users, as well as by consumers at large, in order to kind of rebuild trust in the internet and everything digital and everything online? So I've kind of coined this term good by design, which is not necessarily a fixed or particularly well-defined approach. In fact, I'm trying to explore that with you guys today to see, you know, what works. But I'm conscious that there are an array of different frameworks that people can look at. And of course, some of it's legal requirements, some of which you just have to comply with and know all about, like GDPR, for example. But there are a bunch of other frameworks that you may know a little bit less about, or in some cases know nothing about. And that can be quite confusing for people developing products, because these are like new things that you need to consider. And I just wanted to touch on these briefly, because there's also a lot of these kind of by designs, you know. So data protection by design and default is what's now known as GDPR, but it's also been called privacy by design. And I think that's certainly something that we probably all champion, but there are other things too. So security by design is, of course, industry best practice. It's just what businesses do to make sure their services are secure and free from cyber attacks, or at least as far as possible. Secure by design is the DCMS, Department for Culture, Media and Sports, attempt at defining their own framework for security. Fair by design, you might think that that's easy, it's about just treating people fairly. There's actually a campaign called Fair by Design, which is something I strongly support, around ensuring that we don't let people fall victim to the poverty premium, which basically means that if you use a service online and you're paying for it, the data that that company has about you doesn't mean that you'll charge more due to maybe your financial situation or your credit score or things like that, or your ability to pay over a certain amount of time. It's quite an interesting one, actually, fair by design. But of course, then we also have fairness by design, which is the CMA's attempt to define how users should be treated fairly in the kind of digital advertising space. The CMA, of course, is the Competition and Markets Authority. And as we talk about all these different bodies, so GDPR came from the EU regulation, but is now enforced in the UK by the ICO. We talk about DCMS as government, we talk about CMA as the regulator there. And there's all sorts of different activity going on. There's lots and lots of stuff. And it can be quite difficult for businesses to keep abreast of all of that. So I'm proposing that people think about their own kind of what's good by design. What should people be doing to develop their own rules that go beyond just complying with GDPR to something a little bit more exciting, and that engages consumers or their own customers in a way that really, really builds trust. I think it's about being transparent and making sure everything's consumer-centric, as well as, of course, treating data with respect. And my proposed principles for a good by design approach would be to be absolutely transparent about how data is being used, to ensure that defaults favour privacy. So by defaults, I mean it's turned on by default whatever's turned on by default rather, favours privacy rather than doesn't favour privacy. Giving control to users at all times so that they really are in control of what's shared and what's not. Don't mislead consumers. And consider unintended consequences, and of course, solicit feedback. And we'll go into those in a tiny bit more detail. So on transparency, I think this is about having a really easy to understand policy. And Twitter has quite a reasonable example of one of these where it's actually in plain English and works for kind of humans to read, as opposed to being really, really intense and long and in a difficult font, etc. And it's amazing how just laying things out nicely, as if this was being designed as a product rather than something hidden away, can really increase a sense of trust and understanding in what's being presented. So in addition to having a privacy policy that people can easily read, I would say that building some of this into even the kind of user journey, the customer journey, is also important. So if you have a new product or service and you have an onboarding journey, it could be wise to share some of that information about how data is being used as part of that journey as well. And then you're building trust in kind of right from the outset. Defaults. So as I said, if a user can opt in or opt out of a particular service, that the default state for that is that it favors privacy. So my example here, I found on my iPhone the other day as I was putting this presentation together, you know, and it was actually off by default. So I wasn't limiting ad tracking, etc. So you might think about this the other way around, about opt-ins to things. You have to actively get your users or your customers to opt into something rather than sort of opt them in by default. And again, that builds trust hugely, and not doing that really, really erodes it, because people are like, well, you're just almost tricking me into signing up for something. So I think this is important. And control in the same way. So as we talk about control, you know, this example of Facebook having recently implemented, quite recently, importantly, the ability for people to manage their off-Facebook activity, for example. But again, it's about being able to turn things on and off at any time, not being stopped from doing that because you're further on in your journey as a user or whatever it is. So these things are also, you know, can be classed as dark patterns, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of those, which is basically the idea of, you know, when you're in a product design phase, sort of designing things in a way where it's all, none of it's privacy centric, so that people, you know, are sort of opted in automatically, and that you're hiding the ability for people to opt out. So it's a hugely interesting area, but I think one that's growing in importance and in focus when we talk about kind of product management. And then don't mislead. So I've included this mainly because Which has recently done lots and lots of research into fake reviews. And we're also advocating that fake reviews shouldn't really be allowed to exist, or should be moderated in a way that they're not currently. So our research is finding that, interestingly, fake reviews have the impact of lowering trust in an e-commerce environment or platform. It means that consumers just feel like they're not trusting what they're seeing, they're not trusting that brand, and that's a sad thing. But also at the same time, they do have an impact. So they do encourage people to buy products. They inform and influence purchase behavior. And so we're calling for fake reviews to be stopped, because we think that it does, you know, ultimately it doesn't help consumers, and therefore ultimately it doesn't really help businesses. And then considering unintended consequences is an area that I'm really, really interested in. Because sometimes, sometimes consequences can occur that we just hadn't ever imagined could happen. And that can have a huge impact on consumers. And I have an interesting example of that. I used to work at Amia, which was the company behind Nectar Card, and we, of course, Nectar collected lots and lots of data about people and could kind of predict some things about where they were in their life stages and things that were happening to them at the moment, and then offer them relevant products or services on the back of that, with really good intention. Of course, the intention is good. It's to help people. It's to sell products, but it's to sell products that are relevant to them. And we often told the story or use the example of how a woman, a particular Nectar user, was making certain choices, with browsing certain things online that told the business that she was perhaps pregnant. And then she was offered a whole bunch of services around that seemed to be relevant and certainly well-intended. But that news, as she was sent these vouchers for a whole bunch of baby stuff, it just didn't land well with her family for whatever reason, and we received complaints. So you can see that sometimes, even if you're trying to do something good or that you think is going to be positive, it can really not be, and it can affect people in a really, really bad way. And that was a rather frivolous example, but considering unintended consequences, I think, is really important, at which we're doing that in our work on 5G. So of course, in the telco space, 5G is the next thing that's going to really impact consumers and how we connect online, but also how we use anything mobile. And we see that as hugely exciting in terms of the great opportunities that will bring. But also, of course, it could bring some consumer harm in some way. And maybe that's around people being charged differently for it, or certain people getting access to better connectivity than others. We don't know, but we're trying to think about that at the moment, because it's not just thinking about, the super positives, it's also about working out what else might be needing to be considered. And then, of course, the final point really is to solicit and act on feedback. So if you have a platform where people are posting content, being able to allow people to report things that they don't like, whatever it is about your product, giving people the ability to feedback so that you can learn from it, specific to sort of data privacy and how consumer data is being treated, is of course really, really helpful. And just so that you're aware of our future upcoming research at Which, we're currently working on new stuff around attitudes to online safety and protection from cyber threats and scams. So it's about how people feel they need to protect themselves online, what the measures that they take. We're also looking at attitudes towards social media platforms and their responsibility for content moderation, and we'll be able to produce a report on that in coming months. We're looking at the role of fake reviews, as I mentioned earlier, and also some fresh research on this topic, on consumer attitudes towards towards data collection and consent. So that's coming really soon. So if any of you are interested in learning a bit more about future research that we do at Which, then please get in touch. And in the spirit of soliciting and acting on feedback, I'm really interested to hear from people around, if you feel you have digital services that are already good by design, or that you're building your own principles that go beyond compliance, or whether you're inspired to suddenly, now start considering consumer privacy differently. It would be great to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out by email or on Twitter or however you like. And I'd just like to thank you all very, very much indeed for listening to my presentation. So thank you.